So the story I want to tell you tonight is the story about why I do the work that I do and how I got there. So it all started here at the G7 in Charlevoix. I kind of randomly applied to represent Canadian youth in this process and ended up on the delegation with 3 other Canadians negotiating with fellow G7 youth on the issue of the climate crisis. And while I was doing that, I learned a couple of things. So we keep hearing that the climate crisis is something we should personally feel guilty about. We're told that it's our fault and that we should use less plastic, recycle, compost, bike, fly less, etc. But is that really the case? Because it was actually published in The Guardian that only 20 companies are responsible for 1/3 of our global carbon emissions, and that these companies have known this all along. And they've actually contributed to disseminating false information about the climate crisis. So these companies that have known have continued their destructive activities even though they know that using only the assets they have, so the reserves in currently operating oil and gas fields alone, even with no coal, would take us above the threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which I'm sure you know is the threshold for a safe climate. Why did we let this happen is because the policy infrastructure we have allows this. And that's because we have lobbyists that have corrupted our institutions. In Canada alone, lobbyists have held the equivalent of 4 meetings per day with government officials. So imagine hearing that oil and gas is good for our economy 4 times a day. And the narrative these lobbyists sell is that fossil fuel creates jobs and that climate policy destroys jobs, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan, which now want to separate. But is that really the case? Well, it turns out nope. Between the 2000s and 2016, oil production in Canada has gone up. And at the meantime, we got less government revenue out of this because of fossil fuel subsidies and tax breaks. And at the same time, because this is a high automation sector, jobs actually went down. All of this when we know that communities that are most affected by climate change are marginalized communities. So inside Canada, indigenous communities have their lands stolen for fossil fuel exploitation. Outside Canada, the South is more vulnerable to the effects of climate disasters. So we need big changes that are not only individual. The changes that we need are political, and we have to tackle this by coming together as citizens. So how do we get there, and how do we do this? Well, many things. And my thing right now is working in policy advocacy and lobbying. So remember about the Y7, where I negotiated with fellow youth from G7 countries on climate change? Well, coming back from there, my friend Kara and I wrote a letter to political parties across Quebec telling them to better address the needs of youth, including the climate crisis. There were 175 youth from across the province that signed it, and the policy director at an organization called Equitaire read it. I had actually met her at the Y7, and she said, hey, we have this position opening at Equitaire, you should apply. And I applied, so now I'm a part of this organization whose mission is to help individuals, organizations, and governments transition from the ecological crisis in a solution mindset. Yeah, and I do TV sometimes, as my mom documents very meticulously. Yeah, so my role is I work in policy. My job is to research and influence governments to hype up their ambition to address the climate crisis. A lot of my activism takes place on Twitter. So it's a great place to build community on the field, in the field you work in. Here I am challenging a minister about a very confusing, not to say ridiculous, policy on natural gas exports. Sometimes you also have to applaud when things are good, when good things are done. So here, Équiterre is congratulating the PM of Quebec about an announcement Monday this week about how they're going to recycle refrigerating gases. Yeah, so thinking of influencing policy with Oxfam Québec, I got the chance to work with Julie. Oh, Julie is there, actually. On an awesome project about youth doing influence and all the challenges that this brings. Because when you're a youth involved in influence, it can be tough to deal with the power imbalances that are there, that are in place, often being the wrong side of the spectrum. So we made a video, and I'm actually very stoked and also a bit scared to make it live tonight. I think it was launched, but it's like the first time we're presenting it in public. So here we go.